Yes, well, I suppose I had three heroes when I was a schoolboy. So Darwin was one, and I actually read The Origin of Species from cover to cover and just loved it. I was blown away by the clarity of the argument and the beautiful writing. And even today, you can enjoy it. And what I liked was the way, I mean, lots of people have commented on this, of course, the way he drew in arguments from lots of different sources of evidence to show the power of natural selection. And I think today people get too bent on one particular experiment and showing statistically, hammering away how powerful that result is. And often, I mean, Darwin didn't use any statistics, of course, in The Origin of Species, but what makes his argument convincing is these independent lines of evidence. So there's almost no numbers in his argument. So I think we get today maybe a little bit too keen on numbers and statistics and rather than thinking more broadly about independent evidence.
Not to get too wedded to techniques. There's some people who only do, like you, doing mass spec, and that's all they'll ever do. There are other people who are experts in genetic manipulation and so on. And what I found with my research was that I never got stuck with the technique.
I have more admiration for the people who put two and two together in rather less obvious ways and suddenly realize that a technique developed there can actually be applied to a question sitting over there for the last 50 years that nobody knows the answer to. And where they really are the only person who has realized that we can now address a classic problem. I mean, the examples that I like are probably rather specialized examples, but for example, there has been a debate for the last century about the arthropod head and how many segments make up the arthropod head. And on the basis of comparative morphology, it's almost impossible to answer. And there were a few people who suddenly realized that Hox genes might provide an answer to this. And so Max Telford was one of them who started working on chelicerates and looking at where Hox genes were expressed in chelicerates and showing pretty clearly actually that the then dominant model of how you could relate the heads of a chelicerate, something like a spider or a tick or a mite, to insects was not right, and that instead there was a different correspondence mapped by the genes. So he was a sort of looking at an old argument in comparative morphology and suddenly saying, the molecular biology might give us an answer to that.
I think you have to take risks. I think, if you think, the best way to get at this question is to do something I've never done before, and I'm not sure I understand it very well, and so on. I think you have to kind of take the plunge anyway, and because there is new technology coming up all the time. I mean, here's an example: doing gene editing using this CRISPR system. Everybody here in the building is talking about doing it. Nobody's doing it. Everybody's waiting for somebody else to do it first and iron out all the bugs and so on. And I'm very lucky that a student in my lab has said, I'll do it. I'll get it working and so on. So I think that kind of risk taking, even though it might mean that it takes her longer to get it working out than it would if somebody else worked it out first and she could be biding her time doing something different. I think that's great. I think that's a good sign about her as a student. And I think that when you're running a lab as well, you may be a little bit outside of your comfort zone if people get into heavy-duty bioinformatics, say, which I can't pretend I understand. But I think if you have kind of after a while, you have kind of more of a gut feeling about things. You kind of, you're fairly, you understand things well enough that you know what's sensible and what's not sensible. And if somebody uses some fancy technique that is a little bit beyond you, and then the results make no sense whatsoever, sometimes there is something wrong with how they're applying the technique. Other times it is something just completely unexpected. So I think you have to take risks. I think if that kind of thing happens, then you probably need to kind of bone up a little bit more on the technique and see whether it's because of some flaw with how it's being used, or whether it's because it's just different from how we'd assumed all along.
And the other trait I think's actually important is to really pay attention to data that don't fit. I think often novel insights come from little quirky things that just at first just don't make sense. And if you keep worrying away at it, often those are the key to some new idea.
When I decided I was doing experiments and sort of repeating and getting the same sort of result, I should stop. Sit down and read. Take a week or two out and just read to try and find a new avenue to approach rather than go in and some people just feel they've got to be in the lab doing experiments, pipetting, running gels, day in, day out. They don't spend enough time thinking why they're doing these experiments.
So lots of the experiments I've done don't work at first because I just haven't got the system right. So I'll give you one very simple example. So we wanted to this is work I did with Becky Kilner. So we have a little nest full of begging reed warblers, all begging for food from their reed warbler parents. If there's a cuckoo who parasitises that nest, when the cuckoo hatches out, it throws all the reed warbler's eggs out of the nest, and so you just end up with a cuckoo in the nest. And yet the reed warblers behave to this cuckoo just as if it's a whole brood of reed warblers. So the question we asked is, well, we're trying to explain why these reed warblers are apparently so stupid as to feed this enormous cuckoo when they're geared up to raise a brood of their own chicks. And we thought maybe it's something about the cuckoo that the reed warblers find irresistible. So we thought maybe it's just the fact the cuckoo's so big that leads the reed warblers to love it so much. So to test that, we wanted to put a big chick of another species in, just to see if reed warblers would love a big chick as much as a cuckoo chick. And we put a blackbird chick in. Now, a blackbird's a thrush, and it's about the size of a cuckoo. And when we put the blackbird chick in the nest, the blackbird chick just wouldn't beg. It just sat there and didn't beg, and the reed warblers wouldn't feed it. And we thought this experiment was just not going to work. And then we realised that the blackbird lives in a stable nest, whereas the reeds are swaying around in the wind all the time. So as soon as we anchored the nest with a bamboo cane, so that it was stable, the blackbird immediately started begging, and the reed warblers would feed it. So it would have been very easy to have abandoned that experiment, but we persisted, and just we hadn't got the sort of the setup right. So I think that applies to lots of experiments. People who've got green fingers and get experiments to work are often people who are fussy about getting the setup right. Clean apparatus or bamboo canes or some little trick, and that's all that's needed for the difference between success and failure.